As president at Work Institute, co-author of The Why Factor, Winning with Workforce Intelligence, and a highly sought-after public speaker, Danny Nelms is an agent of change, a thought leader, and an expert in helping companies forge new directions to optimize their human capital and improve business results. He's been a TAB member since 2016. And as AVP of Research and Analytics for the Work Institute, Dr. Lindsay Sears works with organizations to reduce turnover, improve performance, and drive higher levels of engagement in their workforce. She is advancing the science of employee engagement, performance, and retention by uncovering insights through research and analytics and testing innovative approaches in Work Institute's research methodologies and solutions. Danny and Lindsay, if you are ready, I will hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. We're really excited to be here today and presenting to additional TAB members. We actually got a chance just a few weeks ago to present to the Nashville TAB Summit that we had this summer, so that was really exciting. One of the things that I'm finding with my fellow TAB members is that retention is really almost always at the top of the list, and it's a big time worry for most organizational leaders, especially of businesses the size of most of those that are members of TAB. And so I think we are going to find this presentation to be very helpful. We're going to present a lot of research and a lot of information. A lot of it can certainly be found in our 2017 retention report, but we certainly hope that there are a lot of questions that you're going to be asking along the way as well. So feel free to ask those questions and we will answer them at the end. So we kind of start off with looking at the macro conditions that are in the U.S. right now. And no one in the U.S. that runs a company is really immune to turnover right now. And what we see is that it is costing companies a lot of money. And in the U.S., just in 2016, we calculated pretty conservatively that the cost to U.S. companies was right at $536 billion. And yes, that was with a B. And that's a really hard number to get your head around. At $536 billion, it's like the national debt. You just kind of go, oh, $20 trillion. You know, we're talking about monopoly money. We did a little drill when we were doing the local TAB presentation where we had about 30 people or so in the room, and we asked them to just tell us how many folks they had lost in 2016. And what we found was that there was about $1.5 million of turnover costs just in the room with about 20, 25 companies represented there. So it is a realistic cost for almost every company. And oftentimes in smaller organizations, that cost can actually be higher. We use a really conservative estimate of about $15,000 per employee. And that's assuming average salary of around $45,000. But when you lose a key employee in an organization of 15 people, the impact can actually be substantially higher. So if you've never really stopped to think about how much turnover is costing you, it is one of the things that we really encourage every business leader to do, is to not just think about turnover from the standpoint of I lost a good employee or we had to terminate an employee, but how much actual cost that is. Because later on in the presentation, we're also going to mention making investments in retention, and you can look at that very much from an ROI perspective. So just to give you a quick outline of the things that we're going to be reviewing today. So we're going to talk more about the truth about the employee marketplace. We're going to talk about getting to the real reasons employees actually leave and depart their organization. We're going to talk a little bit about the reasons employees stay, which interestingly enough are slightly different sometimes than why they leave. And then we're going to reinforce the fact that organizations must take action to improve employee retention. It doesn't just happen. You have to pay attention to it and you have to do something about it, especially when you can find out the reasons why employees actually leave. So what we see in this chart here is, again, some of the macroeconomics that are going on in workplaces today. And hopefully it's not too confusing a trend chart, but what we see, that top kind of bluish line is unemployment since 2007. So obviously this line should not be that surprising. Clearly we see the recession numbers and the fact that we almost reached 10% unemployment, and then we've seen that decline, and it continues to decline to the point where even today that number is sitting at about 4.5%, 4.6% unemployment, which most economists say is full employment in the U.S. And so the reality is that almost everybody that wants to work is working or has the skills to work are working. And you hear a lot of rumblings about underemployment. You hear about people that have simply dropped out of the workforce. But in many cases, they simply don't possess the skills necessary to do the jobs that are out there today. And that's where we look at the job openings chart. So the third line down from the top, or at least it starts as the third line at the beginning of the chart, is the number of job openings. And what we find is that at the end of 2016, that number was about 3.8 million or so. The interesting thing is that that number has continued to climb, and we have over 5 million open jobs in the U.S. today. So if somebody really wants to work and they have appropriate skills to work, there are more than a few jobs out there for them to take. At the same time, we've seen the job openings increase, the unemployment go down, then obviously we're seeing total separations and quit rates increase. And so total separations basically says that this is everybody that leaves, both voluntary and involuntary, and we see that number's kind of flattening out. But what we don't see flattening out is the quit rate, and this is really the voluntary terminations occurring in the U.S. And that number is climbing to somewhere around 2% of the U.S. workforce that's voluntarily leaving every year. And we see that stay pretty steady every month. So 2% per month actually leave. And so you get a U.S. turnover of somewhere in the low 20% for total U.S. turnover. And again, it is extremely costly when employees leave, and it's happening everywhere. And so the conditions that are getting created are really challenging. And we looked at some of the growth projections in terms of what's going to happen over the next 7, 8, 9, 10 years, and there is no slowing down. We've got some 9.8 million jobs that are going to be created over the next 7 or 8 years. 9.3 million of those are going to be created in the service sector. About 3.8 million of those are going to be just in healthcare and social services alone, and then about 1.9 million in professional and business service jobs. And I actually saw some research just yesterday about the number of manufacturing jobs that are expected to be created over the next 10 years. And unfortunately, the workforce is actually expected to slow by around 17%. So we're creating all these new jobs, but due to the fact that we just have lower numbers in our population that are available in the workplace, we're creating a really difficult work environment and workforce conditions. And really it creates what we call an employee in control marketplace. And so all of these challenges that companies are having related to retention really point to this idea that employees have choices. And if you're a very talented, very skilled employee, you can pretty much go find a job wherever you want to find a job. And so if we as an organization are not taking every effort to create the conditions where employees want to stay, want to work for our company, feel that they have opportunities to grow and develop, then they're going to go somewhere else. And there are plenty of opportunities for them to do that very thing. So you have to look at the conditions that are in the U.S. right now as being very clearly in the employees. It's in their court, and they have lots of choices, lots of opportunities, and keep in mind, and this is one of the things that Lindsay will point out, is that, you know, we have this sort of myth out there that it's always about money, and we're going to find that that's actually not the case. So it's not that employees are just chasing dollars. They're chasing a great place to work, and that's really what we're going to focus on today. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Lindsay Sears. Hopefully you've gotten a little bit of the big picture, and now we're going to jump into some of the research that we did to create our 2017 retention report. Lindsay, take it away.
Thanks, Danny. So just as Danny said, you know, the market conditions really do lend themselves in the employee's favor and toward their choice. And so organizations need to pivot toward understanding what their employees want and then acting on that information to create the place they want to work. Just a little background about myself. I am an IO psychologist, industrial organizational psychologist. A lot of my training has been around utilizing and developing quantitative surveys for employee engagement and satisfaction. But one of the things that really attracted me to Work Institute and made me want to come here is that we take a very different approach to that kind of data collection. It's really not your typical survey-based approach, and the fact is that there are a lot of flaws with that type of methodology in what you can learn from your own workforce. So I'm hoping that my section of this presentation not only tells you some of the insights we learned from our data, but gives you some takeaways for how you could collect data in your own organization more accurately, more effectively, and in ways that are going to lead to some of those actions and changes that are needed. So I'll tell you a little bit about that methodology. First of all, when it comes to exit interviews, there's a lot of research out there that documents that when an exit interview is conducted by the organization itself before the employee leaves, that the reasons just simply aren't accurate. So employees, maybe they don't want to burn a bridge, maybe they want to make sure they get their last paycheck and they're afraid of retaliation. For whatever reason, between 40 and 63% of the reasons employees give before departure when talking to their own organization change when a third party comes in after the employee has left. So you have to think about that window of error that has potential of being there in the data that you're getting from these folks. Also, thinking about the types of methods and how you're getting information, whether it be an engagement or satisfaction survey or an exit interview, there's a huge trend out there around asking long lists of questions to try to get at everything you think might be going on with the workforce. Just the other day, we had one of our clients share a survey that they were using, and it asked if the employee's desk was clean when on their first day, and if their desk was all set up and ready. That was something that somebody in their HR department decided was important to employees, but if they were just asked in an open-ended way, is that something employees would tell us is important to them? That's an open question. But thinking about things as asking in an open-ended way, why did you leave your organization, or what causes you to rate your organization as high or low, and why, we'll get at all possible reasons as opposed to a fixed set of possible reasons we think are going on. And then when you do ask in that open-ended way, you get a lot of information, a lot of dialogue, a lot of verbatim response, up to sentences, paragraphs of information about how the employee feels and what they believe and what they're perceiving. We have a way in our methodology from the data that I'll share with you to quantify all of that qualitative data. It's a technique called content analysis where our trained interviewers are also trained to identify themes within the responses that employees give us, and those themes are then coded in our system and they can be analyzed quantitatively just like survey data, except the biggest difference is we have confidence that those are the real issues and most important issues on the minds of employees, as opposed to coming from a list that we made assumptions are the most important issues.
And one of the things to keep in mind is that when you work in smaller organizations, this qualitative data is even more critical, because in an organization, say the Work Institute here, we have some 17 full-time employees. And so certainly the ratings are interesting and the ratings are good in terms of just looking overall. But at the end of the day, in order to impact the organization, you really have to have that qualitative data. So if you ask, how would you rate your supervisor, and someone says, I rate them as poor, if you don't know why they're rating them as poor and really know some very specific things that need to be improved, then you're just looking at a lot of ratings which are interesting but not very helpful.
Exactly. I like to give the example of, in a survey, you see that your rating of training is lower than the other ratings. Well, we don't exactly know how to act on that necessarily. It could be that the training is insufficient. It could be that the training's disconnected from the job itself, or it could just be that the trainers aren't very nice. So we're still missing some of that key information to act on, whereas if we had just asked why, we'd have a whole lot more information to act upon. And just as a side note, this methodology for asking open-ended questions and coding the responses so that they can be analyzed and reported has been developed over the past 17 years that the Work Institute's been in place. And so we actually have a large volume of data, which is very exciting for me, being the research and analyst here, to get to dig into. And that's really where a lot of these insights came from in our retention report.
I thought she was actually going to call herself a research nerd there.
I love calling myself a research nerd. Very proud of it. So getting to these real reasons. Part of we'll go through several truths. We have 5 truths of why employees leave and 5 truths of why employees stay. And the first part of why they leave is based on 34,000 exit interviews conducted in 2016 alone. Out of this data, we have 65 reasons for leaving in our code set that the interviewers are trained to identify in the data. These roll up to 10 categories of reasons for leaving, so most of the results and insights I'll share with you pertain to those 10 categories. And ultimately, this accounts for 98.5% of all the reasons we hear from employees. That means there's really only 1.5% of the things we hear fall into the other category and aren't captured by our code set. And we see some pretty funny explanations that fall into the other category.
Yeah, that would be an interesting top 10 list on David Letterman for sure.
So here are the reasons. I think that our slide might be a little bit skewed, but I'll just explain to you guys what these top 10 categories are for why employees are leaving. Work-life balance is a category that we see often, and there are actually 5 sub-reasons within it. This accounts for travel and scheduling preferences. You know, it's really rare that we hear people say the words work-life balance specifically, but we'll hear them say a lot about my commute is too long, or I have too many hours I have to spend at work, or I'm traveling too much for work. And so all of those roll up into our work-life balance category. Career development is another area that we see, and that really captures people's opportunities for growth, achievement, and security. There are 7 sub-reasons under this category where we distinguish between leaving for a promotion versus leaving for career paths and opportunities. Another category in there is leaving for simply a different type of work, people looking to shift careers altogether. Work environment is another category that captures the physical and cultural surroundings. So things pertaining to culture and climate fall into work environment, but so do some of the physical things like the safety surrounding the building or just the comfort of the work environment itself. Management behavior is another area that's common. You've probably heard the saying, people don't quit jobs, they quit bad managers. And so that's really where this comes into play, is do employees feel like they have a positive and productive relationship with their immediate supervisor or manager? Job characteristics is another category that accounts for 8 reasons. And it captures things like people's sense of ownership in their work, how enjoyable is their work, and how manageable is it. So things like work overload or feeling like they don't have a voice in the decisions that are made all fall into characteristics of the job here. Another category is compensation and benefits. As Danny mentioned, you know, it's about the money. So sometimes it is about the money. Sometimes, though, it's not just about the base pay, but it's about a promise that was made that was broken. So people may be led to believe that compensation would be a certain level and it wasn't, or bonuses or benefits also fall into this category. And then well-being is yet another category where there are 7 reasons that roll up to that. This captures the physical, emotional, and family-related issues that might be causing employees to leave. And so we do see that a lot as well. And then the last 3 categories pertaining to relocation, retirement, and involuntary turnover are what we consider some of the less controllable reasons for leaving. But they're still important to capture nevertheless, because sometimes an organization's policy might be leading to unnecessarily high involuntary turnover, and that's something that the organization can absolutely try to change. So, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Lindsay, but one of the things, and going through this list, and I just wanted to point out related to the compensation item, is that clearly in the marketplace, there are a ton of surveys out there that will continue to say that compensation is the main reason why employees are leaving. But our methodology allows us to drill beyond that. And many times employees will say compensation is a reason, but then we'll say, well, what else was a reason? And then we'll say, what else was a reason? And they may give us 2 or 3 reasons. And then when we ask them which one was most important, it isn't the compensation reason that they point out. It basically is, I left my job because you didn't pay me enough to put up with X. And all you have to do is fill in the blank. So it's ultimately not about the money. It's about the fact that the money represents something that they are having to put up with, a hassle in the organization, a bad manager, or a job that feels like a dead end, or whatever the case may be. So money is a factor often, but it's typically a factor as it relates to another item. And that's really what you're going to see over the next several slides from the standpoint of what are those main reasons why people leave.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. I have some real experiences with clients who wanted to add questions about compensation. They were so convinced that that was the reason. And ultimately, our data showed that compensation, when people are just asked open-ended questions, did not fall into the top 3 reasons for leaving. There are other workplace issues. So now I'm going to jump into some of the truths about reasons employees leave and reasons they stay. Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into detail on all these truths because they're covered in the retention report in detail, but I'll just cover the top line, high-level insights, and then invite Danny to chime in for any sort of practical experiences he's had around any of these, or some stories that we think might be valuable to you all in terms of learning. So the number one truth, nearly all companies are unique. I have to say, given my background and the work that I did in my dissertation, so many of the academic studies on turnover focus on correlational results and trying to find these universal truths about why people leave their jobs. But I think that this is a really powerful analysis where we looked at all of the clients in our 2016 data set. Out of 173 clients, there were 73 distinct turnover profiles of those companies, of the top 3 reasons their employees left. So it's really not common at all that people are leaving for these same reasons. In fact, when we look at the most common profile, only 13 of those 173 companies fit into that top profile, which is a 7.6%. So this is something we'll keep coming back to throughout the presentation because it kind of suggests that we should not be doing aggregated analysis of this data, that since companies are so unique, you really need something that looks at your unique culture, your unique workforce, and your unique challenges, and something that can address those, as opposed to assuming that you share the most common reasons for leaving as other companies.
And one of the things that's also interesting is that we took a look at just a few companies that we work with who have multiple locations, and we found that this same truth to be almost identical even when companies have multiple locations, is that the reasons for leaving in one location can vary significantly to why they leave in another location. So it's really important to think on a micro level, not a macro level, when you think about how are we going to strategize around retention.
Absolutely. Another truth we discovered, I mentioned that some of the reasons for leaving are more preventable than others. So when you cluster things like relocation, retirement, and involuntary turnover, we're considering those a little less preventable than some of the others. And we've seen, when we looked back at 250,000 of our exit interviews over the past 7 years, we actually see that not only do the more preventable reasons account for 3/4 of the reasons people are leaving, but that has been on the rise in recent years. And we think this supports the trend that Danny presented at the beginning around employees in control. So we see that they are leaving proportionally more for some of those workplace-related issues. So now we get to the top reasons employees left out of our data. Contrary to popular beliefs that maybe it's the manager or the supervisor or it's the pay and people are leaving for that, we actually found that career development is the #1 reason people are leaving their jobs. It accounted for 22% of the most important reasons that employees told us out of their exit interviews in 2016. This is really important to understand that not only is it not always pay, it's not always management, but there are things that you might need to be doing in your organization to create more of a career path for people, to create more growth opportunities, or even just development opportunities. The number 2 reason people left actually pertained to work-life balance. So manager behavior and compensation and benefits have yet to enter this list. Work-life balance, again, pertains to time and schedules and how much time people feel like they have to spend outside of work versus at work. It encompasses things like commute and travel and things like that. The third reason for leaving, let me just move my screen over, management behavior did come into the picture as a third top reason people leave. Again, this is having positive and supportive relationships with their leaders. And here are the rest of the reasons and how they fall out. Now, I'll just remind you again, this is really interesting to know. I think that we were all surprised to see career development come to the top of the list, but when we look across each company, career development is not in the top 3 for all of the companies in our data set. So it just, again, is important to remember how unique companies can be and how important it is to really understand your specific workforce.
And we're actually, when we sat down and started to look at producing the 2017 retention report, it's one of the really tough things that we had to decide, is because one of the things that you see companies out there doing, not unlike ours, is that they're producing all this research that says, here's the number 1 reason why people leave. And I've seen everything from reward and recognition being number 1 to compensation being number 1 to our report that says career development is number 1. But the reality is that this is, as Lindsay just said, it's interesting. It's interesting to look at. It's fascinating to know what is driving most employees, but you cannot take this and definitively apply it to your company, or you could be making a mistake. You could be failing to address the number 1 issue, because the number 1 issue in your company could in fact be job characteristics, or it could be work-life balance, or it might be career development, or it might be amongst the top 3. But you really have to understand in a very reliable way what are the reasons employees are leaving in your organization. You can't just take away from this presentation and say, oh, I'm going to go do career pathing. It's not a bad thing to do, and it's not likely to cause harm with something as benign as career development, but you may not ultimately see the impact that you're looking for in your organization.
Great point. We also looked at the tenure of employees just to understand who is leaving at the highest rate. And we found that it's in the first year, employees are at the highest risk of leaving. Actually, a little bit over a third of all the turnover that we see comes from employees within their first year. So this really speaks to efforts around not only understanding what's happening in your workforce, but making sure you really understand that incoming group. Making sure that they're being oriented, socialized, and onboarded effectively.
And one of the things to consider, and there's not a lot of research out there, and so we don't choose to try and break it down, but anecdotally, in many cases, the cost of turnover is actually higher when you have this huge amount going on in the first year. Because when you think about it, if you hire somebody and they stay 60 days, and they don't make it, or you have to terminate them, or they just leave voluntarily, and then you have to hire another person and they stay 60 days, or they stay 6 months and then they leave, you're never getting that person up to kind of full productivity. And that's what you're looking for. That's where you're going to get your return on investment from bringing a full-time employee in or a part-time employee in, is you want full productivity. And if you constantly have this revolving door, then you're never getting those employees to really full productivity, so you're never realizing the full impact an employee can have. So the cost to the organization is actually much greater than if you say keep people for 3 or 4 or 5 years. Now, certainly if you lose a highly tenured employee, it can have a significant impact. We're not saying that, but you have to have an emphasis on making sure you are getting your employees to full productivity and keeping them for some reasonable amount of time.
Mm-hmm. And there is research to support that it takes employees an average of 4 to 6 months, depending on the type of job, until they begin to demonstrate a return on the investment that it took to find them and hire them. So if you think about that, leaving any time before that, you're actually losing money. Leaving any time after that is just recognizing limited rewards and returns from that hire. So the last piece, truth number 5 of why employees leave, has to do with busting up some of the myths that are out there. We bust up the myths around why women leave jobs compared to men, generational differences, and that millennials are the entitled generation. So I encourage you guys to read more about that in the retention report, because I think there is an entire industry of consulting and solutions to convince you that you need to be managing your workforce in certain ways depending on their age and gender, that I believe we have debunked some of those myths in our retention report. So then we look at some of the reasons employees stay, and I just wanted to say a few words on why we would look at these two different things. We do see that the reasons employees stay are different, and that speaks to a different need. You know, you need to ask the employees who have left why they left in a very accurate and unbiased way. But you also need to ask the employees who are currently working for you, what's on their mind, what are their attitudes and intents. When you do this, incumbent research, whether it be a stay interview or an engagement survey or a satisfaction survey, you're able to assess future turnover risk. And you can do that by asking intentions to stay and how long people intend to stay. But you can also do that through more advanced analytics and predictive modeling if you have a sizable workforce. At the end of the day, it's really important to understand your current employees and the level of risk there. And the most important part of that is the same thing that we apply to our methodology for exit interviews, is to ask the employees why. In an open-ended way, you know, asking them how clean their desk was when they arrived to work for their first day may or may not be a deal breaker for that employee. I'm suspecting it's probably not a deal breaker. But how would you ever know if you're not asking them in an open-ended way? Our engagement model looks at 4 key drivers, and we look at the workplace conditions around those 4 key drivers highlighted in yellow, and that's the organization, manager, team, and job. And so we will ask as part of our methodology for people to give ratings on each of these 4 things, but then we ask them why. Why are you rating your organization high or low? And it's that why that really opens it up to anything the employee wants to tell us, and we're able to code that and report that back. So this is really where you'll find the most accurate information, because it's open-ended and you're not asking them to answer the questions you decided. But it's also the most actionable, because a lot of times you'll hear employees give suggestions that they would like to see change. And following those suggestions could improve engagement and reduce your turnover. We see that ratings on these 4 key drivers are highly predictive of people's intention to stay. People that rate their manager, for example, as fair or poor are 7.6 times more likely to look for a job in the next year than people that rate them as excellent. And that's, you know, you'd kind of expect that. Well, they're rating them either very low or very high, but we even see some of the middle ratings around good and very good. People that just say their manager is good or very good are 2.3 times more likely to leave in the next year than people that say their manager is excellent. So we also encourage our clients and you all to view that excellent category as really what you're striving for, not combining anything that sounds favorable together as your goal. Are you really striving to have people feel like it's okay and favorable, or are you striving for excellence? Another truth we discovered is that the reasons for staying are not the same as the reasons for leaving. So here on the left, we've listed the top reasons for staying according to interviews that we did, stay interviews that we did with currently employed people that say they want to stay with their company for a long, long time. When we asked them why, we did see that career development was at the top of the list. So they felt like they want to stay for a long time because the career opportunities are very strong for them there. But then we saw different results further down the list, job characteristics and the work environment are very large drivers of why people plan to stay for a long time. If you think about it, job characteristics is capturing that rewarding work that people are doing, so they're really liking what they're doing every day, and work environment captures things like the physical setting, but also the culture. You know, we see a lot of times companies that have great culture, we see them reporting that they love their coworkers, that they love the openness, that they love the social support they get from their job. It's just important to understand that the people that make the decision to leave are leaving for other reasons, and all of this taken together needs to be considered when you decide what you're going to change about your work environment to improve retention.
And I think one thing that sort of expounds on this a little bit is oftentimes in our data, one of the things that we see that attracts employees to other companies is they'll often put things like the benefits attracted me. Well, they may be attractive, and you may see things in new companies that you try and find that say, well, what's better? It's kind of the grass is greener. These things certainly attracted me, but ultimately they're not the things that actually cause people to leave. I think the other sort of term that Lindsay uses an awful lot around here is looking at both sides of the coin. And one of the things that you have to do in developing a really comprehensive and effective retention strategy is you have to look at both of these things. One of the sort of research tools that's gaining a lot of momentum in the marketplace is the concept of the stay interview. And there's a lot of training out there for how managers should conduct stay interviews. And we wholeheartedly support the fact that stay interviews are a very effective tool. But you have to know both things. You have to know why people stay, but you have to know why they left. And you have to sort of approach your retention strategy from the standpoint of knowing both of those things. Not knowing just one isn't as helpful as knowing both. So that is critical that you look at both sides of that coin in developing your retention strategy.
Great. We also talk in this section of the retention report around truth number 8. It's really busting up some of those myths and flaws with these common methodologies that are out there. Let's think of the questions we want to ask our employees and get them to give us ratings on all these questions, and whatever they rate the lowest is what we're going to go make changes on. There's actually a much simpler way to get it much more accurate information. Just ask them what they want. Ask them what they're thinking in an open-ended way. So I talked already a lot about how those pre-selected rating topics are really going to limit what you can learn. And you might be led to believe that things are important that really aren't important at all. Also, I think we talked a little bit about how this ratings data doesn't exactly tell you what you need to go do. So the lack of actionability just of a rating alone is a problem that you can overcome by asking in a more open-ended way. Also wanted to point out correlation does not equal causation, and there's a lot of these engagement surveys and satisfaction surveys that will create an engagement score, and it's correlated to certain things in the business, but that doesn't mean it's causing it. Just because two things are related doesn't mean they're causing one another. So, the best way to get at what the root cause is to ask people. You could correlate a training score to an outcome and then conclude that that relationship means training has the biggest influence on the outcome, but it'd be a whole lot more accurate and informative to ask the employee what's causing them to be successful on that outcome, and then act on the information they are telling you. The last point around flaw number 4 is keeping up with the Joneses. The other trend we see out there has to do with benchmarks, and this is the practice of taking data from a lot of organizations, putting it together, and then using it to set standards for what your organization should have as its goals, and what it should consider as a low score, and what it should consider as an acceptable or high score. And this is simply flawed. No other organization is like yours. And so using other people's data to set your own goals and standards is not appropriate at all. And it's actually not that helpful. What we recommend is using your own internal benchmarks. If you can get a rank ordering of your own departments or locations or hospitals, whatever they be, find the superstars and find out what they're doing to drive success in their organizations, and apply those same strategies at the ones that are really struggling at the lower end. Best practices should be coming from within, because they've already figured out how to navigate your culture, your policies, your workforce. So use your own best practices and use your own benchmark. Truth number 9, we did some statistical modeling in the retention report just to find some evidence. We suspected that these reasons that people give for their ratings are statistically predictive and telling us more, and we found that not only are they predictive, but they increase our ability to predict intentions to stay by over 2-fold. So when we just look at age and gender, we actually aren't able to predict much of intention to stay at all. So there you go. Building strategies around age and gender is probably not worth the effort or the investment. When we look at how people rate things like their company and supervisor and add that to the model, yes, we are able to explain about 18% of why people are staying for a long time. But when we asked why and we coded those reasons and added them to our predictive model, we're able to explain 42% of why they plan to stay for a long time, statistically. So if nothing else from this, you can take away that we have statistical evidence that these reasons really do tell you more. And then the last piece has to do coming back to the cost argument. You would be amazed at how much turnover is really costing you when you look at all the direct costs of severance and finding a new replacement and training that replacement. And then there are indirect costs of all the lost productivity while they were gone, and even potentially reduced morale of the people, still at your organization who experienced the loss of that coworker. Turnover is very expensive and it adds up, but that also means that it doesn't take much of an investment in some of your retention efforts and strategies to yield a really high return on that investment. If you can prevent 7 workers from leaving who would have left, you can pay it back. Basically, you have a break-even point on a return on investment of $100,000. So thinking about that, if you're thinking of changing operations or investing in certain training programs or career development things, keep that in mind and always tie it back to those costs.
And one of the things I would point out here, again, considering that many companies represented by tab members are not really large companies. Many of our clients are, where we work with some very large Fortune 1000 type companies. And so kind of looking at this as a $100,000 investment, obviously for a lot of you, including Work Institute, thinking about spending $100,000 on retention efforts sort of would blow our budget out of the water. But again, one of the things that I think you can find is that small investments in smaller companies actually can have an even bigger impact. So if you invested $5,000 in certain development programs, or you could find out, by using a good engagement study, by spending 10 grand to really get at the real reasons affecting engagement and retention in your organization. And many of the things that you need to invest in don't cost anything. They just cost focus, really, is what it amounts to. And then sometimes we actually have to go out and make investments to help us to actually build an appropriate retention strategy and initiate those. So I don't want anybody to take away and get overwhelmed with the fact that, oh gosh, that Work Institute folk, they think everything costs 100 grand. It really doesn't. It's just a matter of what is the size of your organization, looking at the specific things that can make an impact, and then figuring out how to make just some investment in trying to attack the issues that are there. So if people are looking for more development, because career development isn't about just promotions, it's about how are they being developed, then doing a group training every quarter that might cost you a few $1,000s can be extremely impactful on your organization. So don't just think about going out and spending 100 grand. It can be spending just a few $1,000s can also have a significant impact.
Great. With that, I know we've been kind of chiming in back and forth, but I was going to turn it over to Danny officially to close it out and just kind of take some takeaways for action across what we've been talking about today.
Thank you, Lindsay. So, what we want you to take away from this is that, obviously we're presenting you a lot of statistical information. I mean, that is the whole concept around a retention report, if you will, is to look at what did we glean from this really large set of data. And it's really interesting, and certainly it has some important aspects to it. But you notice that a lot of what we talked about wasn't just looking at what we learned the data said, but what we learned about how you collect that data, how you look at that data, what it can tell you if you collect it better. And so we want you to pay attention to that as well. But if you only take one thing away from this, and that is that you truly have to create the conditions of a preferred employer. It doesn't matter whether you're 5 employees or 50,000 or 500,000. It is extremely important that you become a, quote, preferred employer. The better you are as an employer, the better you're going to keep your employees, the more productive they're going to be. And it takes effort. It takes intentionality to become a preferred employer. And, you know, that's one of the things that we work on every day around here, is trying to kind of measure where we are and identify specific things that we can do to increase our overall engagement and being able to retain employees more effectively. We also need to show the financial impact of turnover. It doesn't, again, matter whether you're 5 employees or 50,000. Turnover is expensive, and we have to look at it in terms of money. And given my 20 years in HR, and if for those of you that have HR leaders in your organization, it's the one thing that we often don't do very well, is we don't make the business case for why things are important. And in the case of turnover, there is a very hard cost to losing people, and that's one of the things that we need to look at. Again, getting back to this whole idea that you have to ask the right way in your organization. This concept of open-ended questions is absolutely critical. And if you want to talk more about it, pick up the phone, give me a call. I can give you example after example after example of organizations that use lots of questions and leading questions and biased questions that cause them to misunderstand what was going on in their organization. And in some cases, they've actually caused harm, or at least they have not had the intended outputs that they've expected. And that ends up with the fact that you have to understand and act according to your data. Again, if you take away from this presentation that you need to go build a better career development plan, or that your people are leaving for career development, you've not been listening very well, and you haven't taken the appropriate thing away from this. Yes, career development overall in the U.S. is the #1 reason why employees left. But in individual companies, when we look at them, that turnover profile that Lindsay talked about, the most common profile, meaning the top 3 reasons for leaving, was only the same 7.6% of the time. So it means that organizations are vastly different. So if you're going to act on data, it needs to be acting on your data, not acting on what you see reported out in the USA Today or the Wall Street Journal, or even the 2017 retention report from the Work Institute. You need to be acting on your data. So we really enjoyed presenting today, and we have luckily done pretty well on time, so we've left a few minutes for questions, and I think Julie's going to facilitate that. So we look forward to asking.
Yes, thank you, Danny and Lindsay. I think that was a very, very interesting presentation, and I think we have some good takeaways for our audience. As he mentioned, we are going to take questions now, so if you do have a question, please type it into the question box, and we will certainly get to it. I actually did think of something. You guys had mentioned that a lot of the companies that you work with are the larger companies, so what would you say is the impact of turnover on smaller organizations?
Well, again, I tried to sprinkle some of that into the conversation, but I think what we see is that it actually can be a bigger issue. So when you have 15 employees and you lose one of your key people, the impact ripples through the entire organization. I mean, everything almost is affected by that one person leaving. You know, I'm going to use an extreme example here, but if one person at Walmart leaves, you know, how is that felt through the entire organization? Not very much. It might back up the cash register line in one Walmart store, and certainly that has an impact. But overall, from a large organization perspective, that's not how they're looking at it. But in smaller organizations, just that one person who chooses to leave and go somewhere else can have a significant impact on the entire organization. And the same is true for just how one person affects the overall culture. So paying attention to everything from hiring and making sure that you are developing your employees and you're creating great teamwork, because it doesn't take much in a smaller organization to get it off kilter very, very quickly.
Okay. And Laura has asked, is there a template of questions that I can start with for stay interviews?
So, yes, there really is. Again, I don't know that I would get, if you want to reach out to us, we can try and give you some of those questions, but typically what we rely on are open-ended questions related to job. So tell me about how you like your job. Team, so, how are you interacting with your teammates? How do you feel about the organization? And that is really getting to trust in leadership, the vision of the company, trying to understand those things, and then asking an opening question. And if the manager is doing the stay interview, asking them, how am I doing in terms of how am I managing you? Those are the 4 core drivers that Lindsay talked about earlier. And so you really need to make sure that at least those questions are being asked, those questions related to job, team, manager, organization. And then in stay interviews, we typically think it is important that a stay interview be centered around what's next and what are you looking for in your job, how do you want to develop. So we typically encourage those development questions to be asked in terms of how do you feel about how you're being developed as an employee. That is critical. And then to ask specifically, are there things going on now that are causing you to consider leaving? So those are the core things in a stay interview. Again, keep making sure that you're asking them in an open-ended way. Again, anytime you can create a conversation between the manager and the employee is extremely valuable. However, if you have significant retention issues, if you have significant turnover, there can also be value with asking an outside third party to conduct stay interviews as well, because especially if managers are a big part of the issue, those may not be uncovered when you have just the manager-employee conversations.
Yeah, and just to tag on to that, there is research out of the exit interviews that I covered around having the third party ask some of those more sensitive questions does lead to different answers. But also there's research around anonymity of responses. And so I do think it's important to ask employees how long they plan to stay and why. Are you leaving in the next 3 months? Why? Are you leaving in the next year? Why? But I also strongly, I have real concerns about how authentic employees will be if they're answering that question to their own manager. And there's some research to support that, that if you can assure anonymity, you'll get different answers. So that is where the third party can be very helpful. Having a third party ask where your anonymity is protected. And really getting to the real answer of how long you plan to stay and why could yield more accurate results than having, a manager ask their own subordinate how long they plan to stay and why.
All right, thank you. You also talked about, the actual full report. So where would people go if they want to read the full report?
We have that full report available for download on our website. It's actually workinstitute.com/retention report, all one word. And actually we got enough interest and we had enough data as we were authoring the 2017 retention report. A lot of our clients do come from the healthcare space. So if that's an industry that is of interest to any of you all, or you're in that industry, we published a supplement to the retention report, which is essentially a healthcare retention report specifically. And some of the reasons are slightly different in the healthcare industry. There's obviously a unique context there. And the situation, the economics of the situation are a lot more dire in healthcare around, the need for people to fill those positions and the expected growth of those jobs. So it's kind of an amplified set of issues there. So we have those 2 reports available.
And if you have any trouble finding it, certainly you can email Lindsay or I. When you get the PowerPoint later today, our email addresses are here. Or I think you could also go to email info@workinstitute.com, and we certainly could forward it to you there as well.
Perfect, thank you. And I do have one more question, but again, just reminding you, if you have a question for Danny or Lindsay, type it into the question box so we can answer it before we end the webinar. But you kind of touched on this a little bit towards the end, but I didn't know if you wanted to be a little more specific. If you do have any like specific recommendations for small businesses for, decreasing turnover and bettering their employee retention.
So the one thing I would say is that, and this was a learning for us here at the Work Institute, so I'm going to use us as a big example. So, one of the things that we had sort of stayed away from was sort of taking our own medicine for a number of years. And so we always thought, well, are we really big enough to do our own, quote, engagement study on our own employees? And what's that going to tell us? And really we came to the reality that we needed to just quit worrying about how big we were and just do what we tell companies to do, and that is get real, honest feedback from employees in an open-ended way. And we started to do that a little over a year ago, and we learned some very alarming things in some cases, some really good things in some cases, and we definitely needed to go to work on some issues. And so I think the tendency is to think that when you have small populations that some type of survey or some type of study is not going to be that helpful. And I will tell you that it's been extremely helpful. And again, just a single employee leaving or just a couple of disgruntled employees can have such a significant impact on small organizations. And even if it's not 10, even just 40, 50, 60 employees, it doesn't take many issues to really ripple throughout the organization. So in some ways, I think it's even more important for small companies to be very focused on how they measure and look at employee engagement, the things that they actually do to understand the retention issues that are going on, and to have specific strategies and approaches to how they're going to better retain their employees.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, it's really critical, regardless of the size of the company. We didn't talk a lot about how to take the data to action, but it's critical that you communicate back to the employees how you're going to act on that data. You want to let them know what you learned at some level. It doesn't have to be very detailed, but you want to let them know that they were heard and that you have specific steps you're taking. And then we've done that here at Work Institute. I think it's been really positive. I'd also say continue to ask. So what we do in between engagement studies and what we do for our clients as well are pulse surveys. So we don't ask these open-ended questions every time. We just ask them twice a year. And in between that, we're doing a pulse just to get ratings only and see if we're moving the needle like we thought or like we expected. So that's been really valuable to see those numbers actually go up because we're acting on the things we heard. I would also say because you're a smaller organization, this is a lot easier to do than your big, beefy Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies. They can't just ask open-ended questions and read all the results. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of responses sometimes. That's where our coding comes into play, where we quantify all that for them. But in a small organization, you can read all the results and act on it accordingly. I'd say once you hit about a 100, you should have some more objective way to categorize and count that data up. And then the last just piece of advice I would have is don't be scared. I have, worked with clients before. They're very apprehensive right before they're about to take on one of these initiatives and hear what the results have to say. But it's so important. I like to say that bad news is good news. Even when there are issues, a lot of times it's the senior leader or the CEO of these smaller companies will be very concerned that these results are reflective of them or their performance. But wouldn't you rather know that there's a real problem out there and know what it is and have a plan of attack than to not know it all? So just to call out, I mean, it is a very scary thing to get that kind of feedback, but it's very valuable for improvement.
And just the last thing I would add is that I hope when you spent the last hour with us, we try really hard when we are doing these type of presentations to not turn them into sales presentations. So I hope what you heard over the last 45 minutes or so didn't sound like a commercial for the Work Institute. But if you do have retention issues, if you do have engagement issues, we certainly can help in most cases, and we can certainly be creative when they're smaller organizations or if you just want to have a conversation. Certainly for my fellow tab members here locally, I've met with a number of them just over lunch, and if you just want to have a phone call where we can spend 30, 45 minutes together and I can give you some insights, I'm certainly more than happy to do that as a fellow tab member.
Awesome. Thank you, Danny. We did have one last question come in, and it kind of follows up on a last question she asked Laura. How often do you do stay interviews for small companies?
So I don't think there's an absolute right answer to that. I know for our, quote, engagement study, because we think our company is growing so fast and changing so fast, we actually do a formal engagement study twice a year, and then we do kind of a little pulse survey in between those on a quarterly basis, just so we can get some quick feedback on a few specific things that we've been working on. On stay interviews, one of the things, and I don't want to make this a long answer, but stay interviews have really come into vogue in a lot of ways because our performance reviews, a performance management system is really designed, in theory, to work on what's next, to be able to look a little bit backwards and see what employees are doing well and not doing well, but to really work on a development plan on how they should improve going forward or do different things or where their career is going to go. Unfortunately, in performance management, we've become so enamored with the performance review itself and some tool that we've been giving that says we got to rate every employee on these performance measures. And we spend about 90% of our time doing that and very little time looking forward. And so the concept of the stay interview has gotten very popular with managers doing them with employees because it really is this forward-looking idea. Why are you staying? What can we do to help you stay? Where do you want your career to go? What's next? It's all this conversation about what's next. And the reality is that you can almost never have too many of those conversations. I don't think quarterly is too often. But here at the Work Institute, again, just using ourselves as an example, twice a year we do development plans with our employees so that at least twice a year there is some sit-down conversation talking about what's next. So again, there's not an absolute right answer, but in small organizations, we would typically find that a couple of times a year or every quarter is not a bad idea as long as you can pull that off.
All right. Well, thank you again, Danny and Lindsay. That was a great presentation, and thanks for answering the questions. If you do happen to think of something that you would like to ask that you didn't think of today, their contact information is up there right now, and we will also be sending out the presentation later today. You can check out all of our previous BOSS webinars on demand by visiting our website and clicking on webinars. And within, by the end of the week, you'll be able to register at that same place for our next webinar. It'll be on August 16th, and it's going to be about why small businesses are a cyber criminal's favorite target. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.